Man, like everything else, is only an instrument in the great cosmic process of self-destruction. Philipp Mainländer. So let's start this crazy and incredible story of the most radical and visionary man that philosophy has ever known. At the end of the video, I will propose a personal key to reflect on this vision as cynical as it is disarming, and on what it can still teach us today. Philipp did not limit himself to theorizing cosmic pessimism, but took it to its extreme consequences, intertwining his reflections on life with the absurd and merciless concept that he sees as the only way to redemption, which we will discover shortly. He was born Philipp Batz in 1841 in Offenbach, Germany, the youngest of 6 children in a wealthy family. His father, a successful merchant, was known for his strict nature and the unyielding expectations he imposed on his children. The harsh and oppressive climate left a deep impression on Philipp, so much so that he changed his surname to Mainlander, which means continental resident, as an adult. For him, this represented not only a declaration of independence, but also a way to tie his identity to his philosophical path, away from the weight of his father's expectations and the control that had marked his youth. But it wasn't just his father's authoritarianism that weighed on his existence. His family hid deep cracks, difficult for anyone to face. The first tragedy came when one of his brothers took his own life in a dramatic way, leaving an unbearable void. Shortly after, another brother followed the same tragic path, worsening an already tense climate. The reasons for these actions remain shrouded in mystery, but the rigidity of the family, combined with pain and instability, seem to have contributed to creating an unbearable environment. And if all this already seemed like an unbearable burden, the reality turned out to be even more devastating. Philipp's mother was a fragile woman, deeply marked by serious psychological problems. She had married against her will, a fact that cast a shadow on the family from the beginning. Philipp himself reflected on this reality, stating, "We are not children of love, but of conjugal violence." In the midst of this spiral of suffering, he found comfort and refuge in a special bond with his sister Minna, who not only supported him, but became the only woman with whom he had a significant emotional relationship. In fact, there are no other romantic relationships in his life. Minna collaborated with him in his first philosophical lucubrations, offering precious support in a family context that often despised his ideas. Despite this, Philipp tried to adapt, and around 1860, he left the family home to pursue a career in commerce, as his father wanted. For about 5 years, he lived and worked in different cities, such as Dresden, Berlin, and Naples. During these years, he worked as a clerk in commercial companies and in a bank, but the monotony of the tasks left him dissatisfied. It was during his stay in Naples that an encounter occurred that was destined to change his life. As always, I remember that your support is a very precious gesture and decisive for the future of the channel. Thank you very much. In a bookstore in the city, he accidentally came across a work by Arthur Schopenhauer, The World as Will and Representation. This book struck him deeply. He said he read it all in one go in a single night, so enraptured by those ideas that he forgot everything around him. Schopenhauer, known as the philosopher of pessimism, argued that life was dominated by the will, a blind and irrational force that incessantly pushes every living being towards desires that inevitably lead to suffering. For Philipp, those pages were not only an intellectual discovery, but a revelation. He found there not only an explanation for the pain he felt inside himself, but also a basis on which to build his philosophical reflections. When he returned to Germany, he took with him the impact of that encounter and the desire to further develop those ideas by expanding them and taking them to an extreme conclusion. Upon their return, family dramas soon resurfaced. In 1865, the death of their mother marked a turning point for the entire family, which had already been deeply shaken. The figure of the woman, although fragile, nevertheless represented an emotional linchpin for Philip and his brothers. Her disappearance left an unfillable void, amplifying their sense of isolation. In response, Philip took further refuge in philosophy, abandoning poetry to focus on finding a deeper meaning that could explain the universal suffering he felt within himself. Just 5 years later, his father also passed away. Although his relationship with him had been complex and often conflictual, his absence meant the loss of all parental figures. This event further consolidated Philip's sense of being alone in an indifferent and often hostile world. His major work is Die Philosophie der Erlösung, the Philosophy of Redemption, published in 1876. It is here that Philip introduced the concept that the universe itself is the result of an act of divine self-destruction. According to him, there was originally a single entity, which he called God. This God, tired of his own existence, chose to fragment himself into a multitude of parts, thus giving rise to the universe and the cycle of life. Creation was therefore not an act of love or perfection, but the first step towards total annihilation. Thus he interpreted the Big Bang as the beginning of the decay of God's body, a process destined to end in absolute nothingness. In fact, he wrote, "The world is nothing but the decaying corpse of God," emphasizing how every element of existence was part of a greater plan, which he described as the slow return to nothingness. For him, everything that lives is condemned to suffer, because life itself is intrinsically linked to desire, and desire inevitably leads to frustration. Of this universal suffering, he also wrote, "Non-being is better than being," because according to him, only in nothingness can one find absolute peace, far from any form of torment. His philosophy transformed Schopenhauerian concept of will to live into will to die, a force that pushes everything towards dissolution. "Everything exists in order to cease to exist," he wrote, summarizing his vision of universal destiny. And the most incredible thing was that this philosophy was not just theory, but a practical guide for his own life. After years of reflection and writing, the publication of his main work, The Philosophy of Redemption, marked the fulfillment of his thought. The day he received the printed copies of the book, he decided to take his own life, as if to underline that the message of his work was not just an idea, but a lived reality. He was 34 years old when he committed this act, which represented extreme coherence with his thinking. Yet, his choice cannot be interpreted only as a philosophical epilogue. It was also the expression of an existence marked by personal suffering, a devastated family, and an extreme sensitivity that led him to live intensely every reflection and every emotion. And if all this already seems something crazy and extraordinary, another aspect emerges that consecrates him as one of the most singular voices in philosophy. Mainlander was not just an obscure thinker. His deep empathy towards human suffering pushed him to support progressive ideals that aimed to improve collective living conditions. He firmly believed in social justice and economic equality, proposing models of redistribution of resources to alleviate the difficulties of the most vulnerable people. That is, although his worldview was marked by the concept of annihilation as the only definitive relief, he still sought practical solutions to reduce the suffering of the present. He stood for shared work, solidarity between peoples, and the elimination of social inequalities, convinced that even in a universe destined for dissolution, it was possible to create a context of dignity and respect for each individual. This balance between the radicality of his philosophical thought and his human commitment makes his philosophy unique, a rare combination of existential pessimism and tangible hope for a more just future. His ideas have influenced philosophers such as Émile Cioran, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Albert Caraco, and are echoed in modern discussions of the meaning of existence, the meaning of life, and human suffering. Although his theories may seem radical, extreme, or disturbing, they offer a unique perspective on life's big questions. Now, as promised, I want to share my point of view on this complex and tragic story. First, a fundamental aspect emerges. He lived in an extremely difficult family and context. Two brothers took their own lives, his mother suffered from serious mental problems, and his father was an oppressive and distant figure. Probably, Philip never received the warmth and love that every human being deserves. If we think about our lives, perhaps we realize that we can find reasons to feel lucky. So why not start right from this? If our existence seems rosier or richer in opportunities than Philip's, shouldn't we do our best to make it extraordinary? This is just an invitation to never take anything for granted and to look for the best of what life can offer us. But there is another important reflection. Philip, despite all the pain and pessimism that accompanied him, left an indelible mark on the world. His ideas and his thoughts became works of art that influenced philosophers and intellectuals for generations. And so, isn't it extraordinary that such a tormented life produced something so significant? Does this perhaps teach that creating something, leaving a mark, be it a book, a work of art, an idea, can become the sense and meaning of an entire existence? Could this be the greatest act of hope we can accomplish? That's all for this video. I bid you farewell with the hope that these reflections can inspire you to something beautiful. Until next time.